For 40 years, the only language Silas Blackwood truly understood was that of the dirt. He was fluent in the whisper of corn stalks on the Missouri wind and the contented sigh of the earth after a good rain. It was a language of life, but after his Eleanor's definitive silence began to fill every corner of their farmhouse, the dirt became his only companion in grief. His days became a pilgrimage through the furrows, his boots sinking into the very soil he and Eleanor were supposed to leave behind for the salty air of the coast. That was the promise he broke, the primordial wound of his life. It wasn't just her absence that haunted him, but his stubborn refusal to grant her one simple wish, to sell this place and see the ocean. "Next year, Eleanor," he'd always said, the words now tasting like ash, "after the harvest." But the harvests came and went, and now every sunset that bled its fiery colors across his fields felt like a fresh wound, a promise he could never keep. The whole world of his, the quiet hum of the land and the crushing silence of his regret, was a fortress built brick by brick to keep everything out. So when the rain started coming down in sheets that night, its drumming on the tin roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, he simply turned up the radio to make the walls thicker. But then a sound cut through the noise and the storm. A knock. It was not the wind rattling the frame, but a real knock, small, hesitant, and entirely out of place in the life he had so carefully sealed shut. For more stories that explore the depths of the human heart, subscribe. We bring you compelling, character-driven narratives every week. Don't miss out on the next chapter. That knock wasn't something I could ignore. It was too small, too real. When I pulled the heavy oak door open, the wind whipped in, and there they were, two little ghosts soaked to the bone. A boy, maybe 10, with eyes that held a storm of his own, and a little girl, no older than 7, clutching a soggy, tattered note. They said their mother told them to wait here, that this was a safe place. A safe place? This house hadn't been safe from heartache in years. I'm a stubborn man. My heart had been plowed under and salted with grief. I saw them not as children, but as a complication, a disruption to my sacred misery. "We can't stay with you," I grumbled, more to myself than to them. But the boy, Finn, he just squared his shoulders and looked at me with a defiance I knew all too well. I saw my own cursed pride staring back at me, and I hated it. "Just for the night," I heard myself say, the words feeling foreign in my own mouth. I let them in, closing the door on the storm outside, only to let a new one in. The little girl, whose name I learned was Lily, shivered, her tiny teeth chattering a frantic rhythm against the silence of my hall. That sound, so fragile and alive, was an affront to the tomb I'd so carefully curated. I pointed them toward the hearth, a great stone monstrosity that hadn't seen a flame since Eleanor, since before. "Stand there," I ordered, my voice a rasp of disuse. I went upstairs to a room I never entered and pulled a chest from the back of a closet. The smell of cedar and faded childhood rose up to meet me, a ghost in its own right. I grabbed a small flannel shirt and a woolen dress, clothes that belonged to ghosts of my own. Downstairs, I handed them over without a word. Finn took them, his gaze unwavering. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice steady. While they changed behind a dusty armchair, I busied myself with the fire, kneeling on the cold stone. My hands, clumsy from disuse, struggled with the kindling. It was pathetic. I was a man who had forgotten how to offer warmth. Finally, a small flame caught, and as it grew, it cast dancing shadows on their faces. They were huddled together, dressed in clothes too big for them, looking like lost dolls. Lily was still clutching that damn note. "Let me see it," I said, my voice softer than I intended. She looked to Finn, who gave a slight nod. She held it out with a trembling hand. The paper was damp, the ink bleeding in blue tears. The handwriting was frantic but achingly familiar. "Arthur," it began, and my heart seized. "If you are reading this, I have failed. Forgive me. But I know the goodness you try so hard to bury. They are my life. Please keep them safe for me. Just until I can come back, if I can come back. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. I knew that script. Eleanor's sister, a woman I hadn't seen since the funeral. My fortress of grief, built stone by heavy stone, began to crumble. The single night of loss had stretched, bleeding into an unforgiving expanse of weeks. He was a farmer, his hands skilled with soil and machinery, but clumsy in the delicate art of fatherhood. His attempts to connect with his son were graceless, like trying to mend a fine watch with a heavy wrench. He would try to teach Finn about the inner workings of the tractor, a world he understood. But the boy would just stand there, arms crossed over his chest, a perfect, infuriating mirror of the man's own emotional ramparts. "You're not my dad," Finn would spit, and the words, sharp as shrapnel, would always find that invisible wound inside him, the one left by his own father's chilling distance. The little one, Luna, was different. She was a shadow, a silent follower whose quiet presence was a faint, heart-wrenching echo of Eleanor's gentle spirit. She asked for nothing, a trait that somehow made the burden of her grief feel heavier. One afternoon, pulling Finn's damp coat from the hook by the door, something hard and dense in the pocket knocked against his knuckles. He fished it out. It was a small, hand-carved robin, its form whittled in a style so achingly familiar it stole the air from his lungs. It was the way his best friend, Caleb, used to carve, before a bitter rupture over a wrong choice. A path Caleb took that he could never forgive, had torn their lives apart 4 decades ago. His hand trembled slightly as he shoved the wooden bird back into the boy's pocket. A coincidence, he told himself, desperate to believe it, even as his heart hammered a frantic, undeniable rhythm against his ribs. The world is full of them, he thought, but the weight of this small thing felt anything but random. The coincidence of the carved bird was easier to set aside than the official letters from the bank. He had taken to using them as coasters for his morning coffee mug, a small act of defiance where the damp rings blurred the unforgiving print. It was a futile gesture, an attempt to diminish their power, but their weight remained on the kitchen table. The farm, at once his anchor and his prison, was failing. The seasons had grown cruel, the soil was tired, and his own spirit felt just as depleted, worn thin by worry. Every last cent, every drop of available credit had been sunk into a final, desperate crop of soybeans. It simply had to work. A bumper crop represented his only path to salvation, the one chance to stay afloat and keep this last sprawling piece of Eleanor, this monument to his biggest regret. He would walk the long rows every morning as the sun rose, a silent ritual of inspection. He checked the new growth, his gaze tracing the delicate green lines, willing the plants to thrive with a force he no longer felt within himself. For a few precious weeks, it seemed his silent prayers might be answered. A vibrant sea of green shoots unfurled across the fields, a uniform wave of life that promised a future, or at least a reprieve from the crushing present. It was a fool's hope, he knew, a fragile optimism built on tender stems, but it was the only hope he had left. A faint, almost forgotten flicker of hope had just begun to warm her as she surveyed her work. For weeks, the garden had been her sole focus, a desperate attempt to cultivate life from the ashes of her own. The tomato vines, heavy with green, unripe fruit, reached for the sun, and the zucchini leaves formed a lush, verdant canopy. It was a fragile green promise, but it was a promise nonetheless. Just as that warmth started to spread through her chest, her eyes caught it. It began as a subtle discoloration on a lower leaf, a sickly yellowing that crept inward from the edges like a stain. Her breath hitched, moving closer, her heart sinking with each step. She saw it was not an isolated incident. The blight was a creeping pestilence, a silent, insidious network of decay spreading with devastating speed. Each yellowed, spotted leaf felt like a personal accusation, a physical manifestation of the disease that had taken root in her own heart since Eleanor was gone. A cold, heavy dread settled deep in her gut, extinguishing that nascent spark of hope completely. It was over. The land, her last refuge, was giving up on her just as she had given up on everything else. Defeated, she retreated to the sagging porch steps, her body slumping as she stared at the ruin she had tried so hard to prevent. The air, once filled with the clean scent of damp earth and growing things, now seemed stagnant, thick with the smell of decay. She saw not just dying plants, but a bitter reflection of her own withered spirit. The screen door creaked open, and Luna padded out, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the silent scream in the woman's mind. She didn't offer empty words of comfort or platitudes that would only ring hollow. Instead, she simply sat beside her, a warm, solid weight against her side, a silent vigil in the face of despair. After a long moment of shared silence, Luna extended a hand, offering a dusty, leather-bound book. It was one of Eleanor's old gardening journals. Years had passed since she had last dared to open one, the memories they contained being too sharp, too painful. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, trembled as she accepted the heavy volume. The worn leather felt like a familiar ghost beneath her fingertips. She hesitantly flipped it open, releasing the faint, sweet scent of pressed lavender and old paper. Eleanor's elegant, looping script filled the pages, a meticulous record of a life lived in harmony with the soil, the sun, and the changing seasons. There were detailed notes on crop rotation, companion planting, and delicate hand-drawn sketches of beneficial insects. Her thumb brushed against a slightly thicker section of the book, tucked between a detailed entry on combating tomato hornworms and a pressed pansy. A small section was titled Folk Remedies and Kitchen Cures. Her eyes scanned the page, landing on a simple solution for blight, a spray made from milk and baking soda. It seemed laughably simple, an old wife's tale against such an aggressive disease. A wave of bitter cynicism washed over her. How could something so basic possibly work? It was too simple, too easy. But as she looked from the confident strokes of Eleanor's handwriting, a testament to a lifetime of practical, earthy wisdom, to Luna's wide, hopeful eyes, a different feeling began to stir. In Luna's gaze, she saw not pity, but an unwavering faith. It was a reflection of the hope she herself had lost. The remedy wasn't just about saving a garden. It was about choosing to fight back, however small the gesture. For Eleanor's memory and for Luna's quiet belief, she knew she had to try. For the first time since their arrival, they functioned as a unit. The narrator mixed the remedy in a large sprayer, the same one Eleanor had used for her roses. Finn, after a moment of his usual hesitation, grabbed the hose to help refill the tank, his movements surprisingly sure and steady. Luna directed their efforts, pointing with a serious finger at the patches they had missed, her small voice carrying over the hiss of the sprayer. They worked all day, a strange, broken little team under the hot sun. The labor was grueling and repetitive, but they did not stop. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in those familiar, painful colors, they completed the final row. They stood together, dirty and exhausted, gazing out at the damp fields. That was when it happened. Finn turned to him, a sheen of sweat on his forehead, and offered a small, grudging smile. It was just a flicker, but it was enough. A fragile hope sparked within him. Perhaps he could fix this. Perhaps he could save the farm and build a life from the wreckage. A beautiful, foolish thought had sustained him for a whole week, a fragile shield against his persistent anxieties. He saw it in the fields every morning. The sickly yellow on the soybean leaves was receding, giving way to a deep, healthy green that promised a future. Eleanor's folk remedy had worked, a small miracle woven from old wisdom. It felt as if she had saved him one more time, pulling him back from the brink of despair. With this fragile hope taking root, he began to sleep a little better. The knot of dread that had been clenched tight in his stomach for months finally began to loosen its painful grip. The change was palpable, even within the walls of his own home. His son, Finn, whose teenage years had been a fortress of defiance, approached him one afternoon with a real question about the tractor's engine. There was no challenge in his voice, only genuine curiosity, a flicker of the boy he used to be. The moment was a gift. Later, standing on the porch, he watched his children chasing fireflies as dusk settled over the fields, their laughter like tiny bells in the quiet air. In that instant, he allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated peace, a luxury he hadn't afforded himself in years. It was a terrible mistake. The next afternoon, the world shifted. The sky, which had been a brilliant blue, curdled into a strange, sickly, bruised purple-yellow. The air grew unnervingly still and heavy, suffocating the land in a tense silence. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural roar that was not thunder, but something far more menacing: hail. It came down not in scattered pellets, but in solid, furious waves, a percussive assault, hammering the tin roof and bouncing violently off the packed earth. He and his family could only watch from the window, helpless, as glistening marbles of ice descended like a plague, shredding everything they touched. Every tender leaf, every sturdy stalk was torn to ribbons. In 10 devastating minutes, the bumper crop, the very symbol of their salvation, was utterly gone. The field was left a desolate wasteland of churned mud and melting ice. The hail had been the final blow, but the certified letter arriving 2 days later was the signature on the order of execution, the foreclosure notice. It was crisp, official, and utterly final. The land Silas Blackwood had clung to, the very soil he had once chosen over his own wife's happiness, was gone. With its loss, he felt he had lost the only thing that defined him. He sat on the porch of the home from which he was about to be evicted, the letter limp in his hand, possessing nothing but 2 children who were not his own. He was no longer Silas Blackwood, the farmer. He was just Silas, a man unmoored from his identity, adrift in the wreckage of his life. In that devastating quiet, his gaze shifted to Finn, the boy's face a mask of anger at a world that kept taking from him, and then to Luna, her eyes wide with a fear she fought to conceal. And in that moment, Silas realized the farm had never been his legacy. The dirt wasn't the point. They were. Silas's neighbor Martha had a memory as long as the Missouri River and a heart twice as wide. She arrived the following day with a casserole in hand and a sad look in her eyes, having heard the news in the way that news travels through small towns. They sat together at the kitchen table, enveloped in a heavy silence. He was in the middle of packing a small box of Eleanor's things when his fingers brushed against the damp bag Luna had been carrying the night they arrived. Tucked into a side pocket was a small, faded photograph of a young woman with a kind smile, the edges soft from being handled over the years. On impulse, Silas slid it across the table toward Martha. "This was their mother," he said quietly. "Her name was Sarah." Martha picked up the photograph, her glasses sliding down her nose as she studied it. She remained quiet for a long time, the silence stretching between them. "Why, Silas?" she said at last, her voice soft with a surprise that felt like a punch to him. "I do know this face. That's Sarah, Caleb's girl." Caleb's girl. The words resonated in the sudden vacuum of the kitchen, striking a dissonant chord. His best friend, the man he had excised from his life like a cancer 40 years prior over a profound disagreement, a choice his own stubborn pride could never forgive. And these children, Caleb's grandchildren. The anger and betrayal he had meticulously nurtured for 4 decades came roaring back, now sharpened with a new, terrible focus. This was no longer a mere disruption. It was an invasion. Caleb had dispatched his baggage, his legacy of poor choices, directly to his doorstep. For a fleeting moment, the fragile connection he had begun to forge with Finn and Luna curdled into bitter resentment. But as his gaze fell upon them, huddled together on the sofa, so utterly lost and alone, the fury faltered. This wasn't their fault. It was no longer a matter of revenge. He needed to understand. He needed answers. He held onto the thread of a memory, a place Martha recalled Sarah mentioning once. A friend in a town a few counties over. It was not much, but it was all he had. With the last of his money, Silas put a meager amount of gas in the old truck's tank, enough to get him there, he hoped. He entrusted the kids to Martha's care, his promise to be back soon, hanging in the air between them, thin and fragile. Then he drove. The landscape that unspooled before him was a bleak tapestry of failing farms and forgotten towns, each boarded-up storefront and fallow field a stark reflection of his own reality. He was chasing a ghost, pursuing a whisper of a lead that finally guided him to the destination, its vacancy sign flickering erratically against the twilight sky. Behind the front desk, he found Sarah's friend, a woman whose face was etched with a profound weariness. When Silas spoke Sarah's name, a look of sad recognition dawned in her eyes, and the hope that had carried him this far withered instantly. She was not there. She had left weeks ago, the woman explained softly. "She left this for you," she added, her movement slow as she pulled a thick, sealed envelope from a drawer under the counter. "She said if a man named Silas ever came asking, I was to give it to him." Silas's hand trembled as he reached out and took the package. The weight of it felt immense, a repository of answers he was not sure he was ready to face. A cold dread settled in his stomach. He was not sure he wanted to know what was inside. He sat in the worn driver's seat of his truck, the engine's cooling ticks the only sound in the sudden silence of the motel parking lot. The neon vacancy sign cast a sickly green glow across the dashboard, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. In his hands, the envelope felt impossibly fragile, a relic from a life he had long since buried. 40 years of silence were contained within that thin paper, and for a moment he wasn't sure he had the strength to break the seal. But he did. The first letter was from Sarah. Her handwriting was a testament to her state of mind. Messy, urgent, the letters leaning into one another as if desperate to convey their message. With each word he read, a brick was dislodged from the fortress of resentment he had so carefully constructed around his heart. The woman who emerged from the ink was not the reckless, thoughtless daughter of a man who had betrayed him. She was a mother, desperate and cornered, fighting with everything she had. Her husband hadn't simply left. He had plunged their family into an abyss, a dark path paved with broken promises and shadowed by the kind of company that leaves only ruin in its wake. The danger was real, a palpable threat that was threatening to swallow them all. Sarah wasn't running away from her life. She was running to save it, to protect her children, to give them a single chance at a future unmarred by fear. And she was running to him. The concept was so staggering, it forced the air from his lungs. He, the man who had nursed a grudge for 4 decades, was her destination. He reread the lines that followed, the words blurring through a sudden, unexpected film of moisture in his eyes. "My father always told me stories about you," she wrote, and the past came rushing back, not as he remembered it, but through the lens of a daughter's love. Even after everything. He said you were the most honorable man he ever knew. He said you were solid, like the earth itself. Mum, the praise from the man he had cast as a villain felt like a physical blow, knocking the pride and anger out of him. All those years, he had imagined his old friend's scorn, when in reality, he had been held up as a paragon of honor. "I'm so sorry to ask this of you," the letter concluded, "but you're the only safe harbor I could think of." The paper trembled between his fingers. The antagonist of his life story, the shadowy figure he had raged against in the silent solitude of his existence, was not her father, and it certainly wasn't her. It was the story he had told himself, a 40-year-old fable of betrayal and righteousness. It was his own stubborn, corrosive pride. Behind the crisp, modern pages of Sarah's letter, another was hidden, a ghost from a buried past. This one was different. The paper, yellowed and fragile to the point of disintegration, threatened to crumble in Silas's trembling hands. The edges were feathered, the folds worn to near transparency. A single tremor ran through him as he recognized the script. A bold, slightly slanted cursive he hadn't seen in decades, yet it remained etched in his memory, achingly familiar. It was Caleb's. The letter, he realized, had been penned shortly before Caleb's definitive silence, that final departure a few years prior. He must have entrusted it to his daughter, Sarah, a final, sealed message to be delivered only when necessity demanded it. The thought sent a fresh pang of regret through him, that his best friend's own child was a near stranger to him. As Silas carefully unfolded the brittle paper, the words blurred through a film of unshed tears. Caleb's voice, silent for so long, spoke from the page. He wrote of their shared youth, of an inseparable friendship forged in the dirt and sunlight of the farm that was meant to be their shared destiny. He wrote of the stupid, prideful argument, a single, heated moment of anger and misunderstanding that had shattered their dream and erected a wall of silence between them that had lasted nearly a lifetime. Caleb's confession lay bare on the page, a raw and painful admission. He apologized for the irreversible decision, the disastrous investment that Silas had seen as a profound betrayal of their bond and their future. "You were right, Si," the letter confessed, the simple words a gut punch of validation that had come 40 years too late. "I was a fool." The ink seemed to bleed the loneliness of the intervening years. "But I was a lonely fool without my best friend." It wasn't an excuse, but a stark declaration of the price of his pride. The letter was a plea for forgiveness, a desperate reach across the chasm of death and time from one old friend to another. But it was the postscript, a final, hastily scrawled addendum at the bottom of the page, that truly shattered the dam of Silas's composure. The weight of 4 decades of resentment, regret, and sorrow crumbled under the force of Caleb's last request. "If my Sarah ever needs help, I told her to find you. Please, watch over my family. It's the last thing I'll ever ask." Suddenly, the 2 letters, one from the past, one from the present, made a terrible, beautiful sense. Caleb's words were a bridge, explaining Sarah's plea for help. Her letter was no longer just a message from a stranger. It was the enactment of a sacred trust, a final, desperate handshake across the grave. The deafening silence between the 2 old friends had finally been broken, replaced by a single, profound responsibility. He had been asked for forgiveness, and now he was being asked to fulfill a promise. It was the last thing Caleb would ever ask, and Silas knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his weary bones, it was a promise he was bound to keep. There, in the cab of his dying truck parked in the desolate lot of a forgotten motel, he faced a choice. He could continue to hold on to the cold, hard stone of his anger, a familiar rage he felt he had earned over 40 years of suffocating silence. Or he could do the hardest thing he had ever done. He could choose to forgive. It would mean forgiving Caleb for his devastating mistake and forgiving Sarah for placing such an impossible, crushing burden on him. The most difficult act, however, would be to forgive himself. Forgiving himself for the long years wasted nursing a bitter grudge for the sacred promise he had broken to Eleanor, a failure that had haunted every single sunset since she had been gone. With a trembling hand, he let the worn letters fall into his lap. He let it all go. The sound that finally escaped him wasn't a cry, but something more visceral, more profound. A cracking open. It was the unmistakable sound of a stone heart shattering, at last breaking free from the desolate prison it had so carefully constructed for itself. When Silas returned to Martha's, the children ran out to the truck. They didn't ask where he had been or what he might have found. They simply looked at him, their small faces a tense mixture of hope and fear. In that moment, he was no longer Silas Blackwood, the failed farmer haunted by his past. He was just Silas. For the first time, as he looked at them, he didn't see the heavy weight of his brother's legacy or a complication to his own misery. He saw family. He saw Finn's defiance not as a challenge, but as a shield, and Luna's profound quietness as a deep well of strength. Kneeling, Silas pulled them close, the three of them forming a tiny, unsteady island against the world. They had nothing, no home, no money, no plan for what came next. But the silence that enveloped them was no longer empty or oppressive. It was just quiet. And within that quiet, a new sound emerged, faint yet unmistakable. It was the sound of his own second chance, gently knocking at the door.